thank you for coming on Power Talk. It's been a long time coming.
Indeed.
We've known each other for a long time, and a lot of work that you do has just impacted how we look at youth violence full stop, the youth sector. Just explain who you are, what you're about, how we met. Give us a little bit of insight.
Ray Douglas at Gangology, Gangs and Systemic Youth Violence Practitioner, with a national remit around early intervention, behaviour change, and CPD for practitioners. So in terms of how we met, nearly a decade ago now, I think, you coming up to Birmingham and partaking in one of our early kind of training programs. It doesn't seem like 10 years almost, but you know, and we've just kept it real since then and stayed in contact. But you know, I'd like to say, you know, gone on to become friends.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've always just respected, 10 years ago, you were talking about issues around youth violence, dominant youth culture. Even then, 10 years ago, we knew there was an issue going on, not just in London. You definitely opened my eyes to the wider perspective of what's going on in the UK. And just some of the people you brought around the table, Dr. Martin Glynn, we had Craig Pinkney on here, you know, it's people who are just now, in my opinion, some of the best people in this field. How did you manage to gather such, I suppose, minds all on the same level, but at the same time in your own different lanes of bringing something very special?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you know, the conversation we always have about the two trees that are born, grow next to each other, and one will blossom and the other one will die, even though they're 5 meters away from each other. And because of the nature of Birmingham, although it's labelled the second city, it's very small. Around the city centre are a lot of deprived communities, and then the second tier of communities are kind of more affluent. So the violence around the main city, you are going to bump into people in the barbers, in the food shop, in a club. But what that also meant now, it's almost like the boot room. So because Birmingham had a massive spike in violence, and it's still labelled the gun capital of the UK, what it also birthed was many kind of innovative practitioners who would see each other, who would share ideas, who would bounce kind of new innovative ways of thinking off each other, and we would support each other and grow. So what you saw there was different people at different times of their career, you know, who've gone on to become international practitioners. You mentioned Craig. There were so many others who were there over that weekend, that 3-day program, that are still, you know, fighting the fight. Even Dr. Glynn, you mentioned he wasn't Dr. Glynn then.
No.
So that's why I think Birmingham's quite unique, and there's quite a fair few practitioners who are seen as kind of nationally as thought leaders. And
it's good that you mentioned Birmingham, because what tends to happen is that when we talk about this issue, a lot of it is very London-centric. And it'd be great if you could just give us an idea of what it is like in Birmingham, but not just in Birmingham, outside of London. Like, are the issues the same? What are the differences?
Yeah, so fortunately my role allows me to work nationally, and the commonalities around the violence are very, very clear. I'm sure you've explored that numerous times, but culturally, city to city, the issues are nuanced, the conflict is nuanced, the communities that you're engaging with are different. So if I'm in kind of white working class Wigan tomorrow, and then like the day after that I'm in Liverpool, and the day after I'm in Manchester, and then I'm back down in Devon, and you got these different communities. What I focus on is the intersectionality of dominant youth culture, which is driven a lot by music, film, art, fashion, language. And what I've noticed working nationally is that there's this centrality around culture that's so similar, whether it be South Asian, Pakistani, Bengali, Afro-Caribbean, African, white, middle class even. So that's probably one of the best things that's happened working nationally, not just sitting in our city or sitting in one particular borough. That's allowed us to grow. And I believe it's a skill set that not a lot of people have got.
Yeah.
That the first time you meet a group of people is the first day you walk in.
Yeah.
how do you impact that? How do you ensure that you leave some legacy? How do you make sure that, you know, you've moved the needle?
Yeah.
And it comes with muscle memory by being able to, you know, being able to travel and being able to see and work with communities.
And it's interesting you say it, because it just feels, whether it's the press, media, whatever you want to call it, they've really boxed and had this kind of binary approach to what the issue is. It's a particular type of young person from a particular type of background, and they have a particular type of race. And
we call it the black lads from the flats.
The black lads from the flats. And what I think I heard you articulate this really well in Victoria, Derbyshire, was that actually it's becoming, you mentioned it earlier on, dominant youth culture. Just break down what that really means.
I mean, in short, a minority of young people are those who, they're involved in violence.
Yeah.
But if you look at the culture, fashion, as I said, music, film, language, it's all interconnected. So someone might be, I was in a school yesterday and a teacher was sitting on a session, he said, in the middle of the session, he said, I've got a real issue with these young people calling me fam and blood. And I said, I hear that, sir, but, and I was saying sir because he's in front of the children, but essentially they're calling you family. They're saying that you're close proximity. Right? It's a term of endearment. And it's not to be looked down upon because that's their culture, right? You probably got some umbrage because you're a different generation, and I get that, and there's a respect element. But as I said, if I go up north, they'll say the same thing. If I go down south, they'll say the same thing. That's youth culture, but that culture's often connected to gang culture. And that's not to be feared. The thing not to be feared is the violent element of it, which a majority of young people are involved in. However, as it becomes the dominant culture, it's giving a window to that culture to those young people who historically wouldn't be involved. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we talk about. So I spent a lot of time with some medics recently, in recent times. Some of them will be qualified doctors now. They'll drop a blood on you. They'll go to a grime concert, but they have the ability to switch off.
Well, that's interesting. There's something about code switching, which I've written about this recently, where particularly with black people, people of colour, we have to code switch in ways which maybe white majority culture do not. You know, how we are with each other, how we are with our friends and family, how we are in a professional context. Yeah. We're constantly having to code switch. And therefore, when that culture then clashes with another institution or culture which is not used to this code switching, I then sense fear, confusion, and the unknown. How much of that do you think is the problem in terms of how institutions such as school, police, even the criminal justice system struggle with engaging with minority culture? Do you feel there's a problem there, and how do we address that? Two cultures clashing.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to go far back to when kind of our parents came. You know, the overarching strategy around assimilation, which was replaced by community cohesion, which was replaced by multiculturalism, and actually there's no strategy now that people can buy into. You know, the strategy that people are fearing the most is the Brexit kind of, you know, with big society as well, what happened with that. What people, I think, to answer your question, what people haven't realised is that back to the dominant youth culture is it leans on our Afro-Caribbean culture through the language, through the music, through the fashion. It's just how it is. Yeah. Our culture is very visible. But if you look historically, what's happening, this would be probably the thing that I have an issue with, is our cultures they extrapolate the worst parts of it. Yeah. So someone like my father, who's Windrush, that generation came to this country with no criminal records. 97% of those men and women came to this country with a qualification and a trade. What I would be asking is why 50 years later are some of these YOYs, youth offending institutes, why is 65% BAME?
Well, yes.
Because our culture, that shows you the tree that we're from. We're not from we're not from a tree of violence and a tree of shut-in, and we're from, excellence. When you look at those black and white pictures of people streaming off Windrush and coming into the country, look how they were dressed.
See, absolutely, and then we got to ask the question, what shifted then?
Exactly, what shifted?
Yeah. So what did you?
Well, here's the thing.
Because just to cut you, some of my older family members would say, do you know what? It wasn't our generation.
Yeah.
When we came here in the 50s and 60s, they blamed the 70s and 80s lot, which I have questions about. But what happened?
Yeah, which were housed under the assimilation and multiculturalism model.
Right.
So we'll give the Afro-Caribbean their centre, we'll give the South Asian Pakistanis their centre, the Irish can have a centre, the Polish can have a centre, but you're actually not learning from each other, you're living in silos.
Yeah.
What this generation of young people have done is bypassed all that, and what are our commonalities? Well, the music, the language, the fact that we're struggling for identity. What is Britishness? What is, all these conversations that young people will not formally have, but work through.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about developing that belonging. Now, the problem alongside that though is it's gone the full circle. We were, okay, this area, this postcode, this road is my belonging. Because you don't belong in the wider infrastructure. You don't see yourself in places of power. You don't see yourself in places of policy. You don't see yourself in places of change. So I'm going to own this. And in some cases, they'll die for it.
So it's interesting, you spoken a little bit about music and media. 10 years ago, you were the first person I know who coined the phrase murder media.
Pre-trap.
Pre-trap, pre-drill.
All of that, yeah.
Pre-UK rap going #1 in the charts.
Yeah.
Pre-mainstream radio stations playing urban music in daytime or urban UK music daytime, murder media. 2 questions. Break down what that is, that concept that you brought 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And also, what shifted in those last 10 years to either make this concept even more important now or less important?
Well, not a lot of people know that, but, I was a signed artist at 17. I'm
going to ask you to freestyle.
So, no. I'll sound like Grandmaster Flash and Melly Mel.
Oh, you don't want that.
Signed artist 17, toured with many American artists, had an insight into the record industry quite young, was signed to Excel, a subsidiary through them as well, just as a production deal. And then I went on to I walked away from that, went on a journey of searching of knowledge of self. In my early 20s, retrained as a teacher, adult education teacher, but I'd always been involved in youth work. So what I did was, as I said, back to Birmingham, you have to understand back about culture. So if you think about Birmingham in the 80s, 90s, and Birmingham and surrounding, you've got things like UB40, you've got things like the Specials, yeah? Now I think you've got the football hooliganism, the Zulus, multi-ethnicity cultures. You think about this, as a Chelsea fan that you are, if you think about Birmingham and the Zulus were seen as the first multi-ethnicity football hooligan firm, right? People from other towns had never seen anything like it, where you'd come off the train and you'd see black, white, Asian, Chinese, mixed race steaming in, right? So likewise with our understanding of culture, on your road and where you lived, it'd be reflective on like that. You'd mix. Communities would you'd have your South Asian, Pakistani friends, you'd have your white mates, you'd have your black mates, So you see it in the music, you see it in the culture, but also you see in some of the communities so where we're from, the part of Birmingham we're from, historically you'd always hear around Handsworth and Newtown, which are the ones that have always been identified as kind of the most active gang kind of affiliated spaces. But we're from the other side of the city, where you had more guys who were into earners, dancers, rowers, Zulus and all that kind of stuff. But Birmingham's still a very small place, so with no traffic, you can drive in and out within 10 minutes on a quiet night.
I've never had the experience driving in and out of Birmingham.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's back to, I'm a real kind of fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and it talks about tipping points. So the gang situation in Birmingham is 30 years and change old. It's not like 10 years, And going back to what you were saying is what it allowed us to learn very quickly and have an understanding of culture and how it changes communities. So where I'm from particularly, there were like 3 or 4, 5, 6 signed artists in that night. It's just in my,
in your,
in around people you bump into, because you're allowed to innovate. Bringing it forward to what you're saying about me mentioning 10 years ago what music is going to do and currently doing, it was because you don't lose the artistic gene. So if you go back to the rave era, for example, and so on, the side effect of the rave era was Class A drugs. Then it moved out of kind of techno into rave, into jungle. What started happening in the jungle era? It started getting a little bit violent. Jams started getting closed down. People still loved the culture, but thought, oh, it's getting a bit rough in there. Let's go over to the drum and bass. The jungle crew kind of went where it did, and then what's birthed out of that culture?
Well, what came out of that was UK Garage. And I only went to UK Garage because that's where the girls were.
There you go.
And then that started becoming violent.
Okay. So the progeny, if you go back, all right, and back to even Afro-Caribbean culture, people often think, that everyone was into dancehall. So our parents' generation, they weren't into that. Wasn't where they're from. No. They weren't. I would argue some of them weren't even into Bob Marley. No. They're like John Holt and Nat King Cole, and they're on a different. So understanding where we've come, what I saw 10 years ago was, hold on a minute. Every other track I'm hearing is promoting violence. I get it, but let's, for example, talk about American. Let's talk about Queens. As much as Queens is very similar to some of the places in London, you'd have Nas, you'd have CNN, but you'd also have Run DMC, you'd also have a Tribe Called Quest. So you've got 4 different artists from the same area speaking about their lens. Different, Run DMC never swore on a record. People don't realise that. We don't need to get into Tribe Called Quest, Nas, and Onyx. They're all from the same area, Queens,
sure.
But all had a different message. But what I was starting to see is, hold on, why is everybody talking about bossing their gun? Why is everybody talking about the trap? Why is everybody talking about I'll run up in your mum's yard? Where are the tribes? Where are the what I'm saying? Where are the kind of street disciple type? Okay, I'm road, but I'm conscious. But then the dominant culture became more of that. So when you saw me talking about that 10 years ago, most people are like, I don't know where you're going with this, Ray. 10 years on, I'm in primary schools and children are telling me the name of trap artists that they're not even the mainstream, they're talking about these underground ones. And I'm looking at these little 8, 9, 10-year-olds because they listen to it from their older siblings or, the YouTube or whatever.
How much is that, sorry to jump in, but how much is that to do with technology? So if you take, when I was growing up, when I was like 15, you're right, there was a tribe. You could listen to Tribe Called Quest. You could also listen to Dr. Dre, and you were listening to Wu-Tang as well, and you can listen to your Nas. But I'm in my house in South East London, these guys are in Queens, LA, whatever. Whereas now, I always say 2 things have changed. Proximity to, from artist to consumer has closed down, got closer in this country in the sense of now, when you're taking your Stormzy's and your J Husses and all these other artists, the likelihood is that you know what state they came from, what area they came from, in a way that I didn't have that kind of connection with the artist. So that's one thing where I'm saying as technology kind of shifted that closer. The other thing is just, has technology also made it a lot easier for people to just make music. So when I used to run a record label in 2004, you know, the idea of, okay, you record the track, you master the track, you press the track, you try and get it into a record shop. By the time you've even made £1, you've spent, and the video what goes on Channel U, you've done almost £2,000. Nowadays, it's like, well, I can do this in my room, I can do that in my room, I can shot something on my iPhone, and I can upload it to many different social media, and 6 months' time, I've got 500,000 views. How much has that kind of made the impact?
Well, yeah, really good point. But one thing you can't lose sight of, that it's a false economy.
Yes.
So 1 million views actually don't mean anything because it doesn't generate
£1 million.
No. Just so you've got this false economy where the industry, unless you're doing high numbers, and the high numbers are generating bookings, and the bookings are generating merchandise and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, obviously the streams, but do the maths on what kind of streams you'd need to get a real, you know, solid...
It's Ed Sheeran numbers, isn't it?
Right. So, and this is me speaking to an artist yesterday he's touched 1 million, or touching 1 million right now. Is that false economy that we're talking about, the industry, is one element. But in pursuit of that, the music's got more violent. See, people always ask me, is music the reason? It's not the reason, but it reinforces. Yeah? Music's not the reason, but it reinforces.
But here's an argument. So it's good, we can have the conversation, but the argument would be that some people I know, my age range, I'm a touch younger than you, not much, but like, would say that, you know, in the 90s, we had Notorious B.I.G. So I did an experiment the other day. I listened to, I think it was Life After Death, because I wanted to see whether or not actually is the music, you know, Life After Death, Notorious B.I.G.'s second album. I thought, well, let's see, is that as violent as some of the stuff which we're hearing today? And if I'm honest, that album's a violent album. It's a very violent album.
But it's a hack.
Go on.
It's a hack because you've got hardcore lyrics over R&B.
Okay.
So it's not threatening.
So I can dance to it in the club with my woman, but
right?
ultimately...
Yeah, it might get played at a christening, it might get played at a party, it might, you understand? It's a hack. That was the hack. That, how do you get it into the mainstream, but keep the rawness?
Right.
A lot of the artists now are doing the same thing. So if you hear some of the sounds, and you know, I don't want to go too far into this, but I'll ask people to go away and study sound. Go and study it. You know, when was the last time you heard a death metal song on Radio 1? On drive time? It's still a big seller, right? But sound is something, frequency, you know, the neuroscience behind it. So with that, things like the album, and funny enough, I've never heard the album. I've heard some parts from it.
I'm not going to recommend it.
No, but you get me from a case study perspective.
Yeah.
And that's what we see now. The hack has happened here, where you've got the softer sound with the harder lyrics.
And it's a good point, because that, you know, without trying to get too deep, that album was produced by Puffy, P. Diddy, Bad Boy at that point. I think the statistics show that at 97, 80% of all radio play in America came from a Bad Boy production line, one of their producers. So you've got to understand that level of influence to get on radio, where they're sampling Diana Ross, and they're sampling Jackson 5, and they're sampling anything with a soul beat.
Yeah. But let's go back to someone who, and some people who I kind of came up through listening to. So when you hear the 10 Crack Commandments, think about that. You know, allegedly Chuck D was furious, right? Because they've sampled his voice. Premier's sampled his voice. The 10 Crack Commandments, right? Now think about that. What you're teaching, right? Through that. The beat's fat. The cutting's amazing by DJ Premier as always. But you're teaching the 10 Crack Commandments, right? So likewise now fast forward, but is it radio friendly? Yes, right? But in the UK, it wasn't. They weren't there yet. It was still coming out of kind of like the era. Now in 2019, me and you are sitting here. There's tons of 10 Crack Commandments all over a similar version.
Of course.
what does that do? What does that say to us? Does it, what in terms of our moral compass, in terms of our value base, in terms of how it promotes black rage, in terms of how it promotes the killing of, primarily amongst, you know, black youth, and we know it affects all other communities. So back to the word, it's not the reason, but does it reinforce? Right? I'm in a birthday party, December, true story. They've got an entertainer, you know, they do the clown stuff and the balloons, right? So I'm sitting there. I'm already, like, don't want to be there because I don't think we should have...
Clowns?
No, I don't think you should have a 1-year-old birthday party because the 1-year-old doesn't know they're there. They're just getting passed around.
Yeah, but it's never for the 1-year-old.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's always for
to shine.
And when there's Prosecco around, you know it's definitely not for the 1-year-old.
Right.
So, yeah.
So then tables start moving.
Okay.
Chairs getting put back to back. True story. I'm sitting there, what's going on here now? And you've got all these 3, 4, 5-year-olds running around, getting prepared. They go over to the entertainer goes over to the amplifier, whatever it was. They're putting Man's Not Hot on. So when the kids are singing along to it, that girls are uckers, the ting goes scrat, all these other things, yeah? Yeah, we know it's a spoof and a parody and all that kind of stuff, but you've got toddlers. They're not singing Ring a Ring of Roses, which they should be at that age. They're not singing, you know, all the classics.
On the bus.
Yeah? They're talking about the ting goes scrat. These are toddlers and I'm watching this.
Yeah.
Right? So are we saying that that's not going to have effect on children?
Of course.
The misogyny in there, the violence in there, is that what we're saying? And I'm happy to be challenged on it, but go and see what the academics say. In order for violence to blossom, you have to plant the seeds. Just like the opposite of that, the reverse engine it. In order for peace to blossom, you plant the seeds for peace.
Well, I mean, I think you touched on something, because there's been people even on PowerTalk who've basically challenged that notion to say, well, it's not really the music, and the focus too much on young black kids making drill ignores the wider issues: poverty, austerity, school exclusions, the government. A lot of people would say all this type of stuff, but what you're kind of saying is actually, while that's all, I'm not denying that's not true, I think what I find is that we don't want to, and I always say, when we say the black community, it's not binary, it's not a monolith, so even that, we have to be careful what we're saying when we say the black community. But we've got to look at ourselves, haven't we? And say, what are the seeds that we plant?
You've got to, of course you've got to do housekeeping.
But people don't want to do that housekeeping.
You've got to do housekeeping. When I'm in Liverpool and there's white working class gangs up there, or I'm in different parts of the country, you've got to do housekeeping. For me, you know, the benchmark is this: what we're doing, is it raising the consciousness? Right. When other communities are building, right, and when other communities are not seeing the levels of violence that we're seeing, when I say we, a royal we, right? Are you saying there's no introspection? Are you saying that there's no housekeeping that we need to do? Right? I work in prisons, you know, and I don't like working in prisons, not because what we're doing doesn't have impact, is because I don't want to get compassion fatigue for seeing young black men locked up. Right? In some of the, some of the statistics, some of the things that you see, right? So how are we going to resolve that? And the approximately 20 prisons I've worked in, I've never heard Adele coming out of a cell.
Not even like a jungle remix or something.
Not even, and apparently, man do listen to it, but it's turned on at night when they're reflecting. But my point is, I'm saying, what are we doing? Does it raise our consciousness? Yeah. Right? Ultimately, that's what it's about. Does it raise our consciousness? Life expectancy. Does it change our situation? So all the things around, you talk about woo and stuff like that. But that classic lyric, like when he talks about like black unemployment, all the things, and the woo is like a lot of us. You've got different consciences. Yeah. So you've got you're the jizzer one day, but you might be ODB another day, but another day you might be, might be a redskin method kind of flex, you're giving it.
Yeah.
The different, he looks at the different conscience of the human. I'm saying, does it raise our consciousness?
Yeah.
When I'm seeing every other track referring to licking down a man, nigger this, shooting that, does it raise our conscience?
But you know, they got one gospel track on the album, so that's all right.
I don't think, you know, I know, yeah, I get that, but I think for me, right now, everyone can have their opinion. But when you're working with families, and when you're working with guys behind the door, and when you're working with little kids who are seeing violence as the first option, right? Of course, all those other things that you mentioned are valid and they're important. You know, you can't. It's interesting because, you know, the gentrification of youth violence has happened now. So now that music is pop music. So when you're looking at the festival footage and you're looking into the crowds, it's not the black lads from the flats who are spending £150 for the weekend just on the ticket. And all of those young people and those people in the crowd know the lyrics verbatim.
Well, do you know, this is a fascinating point, because I was talking to somebody else about this recently. And I think it's probably your generation, you talked about that you were signed. And if you were going to be signed back in the day, you'd have to have done like your rites of passage. And from a garage and grime perspective, your rites of passage was you better be able to MC in a youth club, you better be able to hold it down in pirate radio, or then you better be able to hold it down in a rave, and then you better release something, and let's see what the response is like on Channel U, then you'll get signed. Whereas now what you're seeing is that people are getting signed. So you know, there's an artist I won't name who had one hot track and then was doing 80,000 at Wembley and struggled. And you're kind of like, well, I wonder why. Because somewhere along the line, whether it's a rites of passage or, you know, just that training disappeared. So I suppose the concern for me is that everything now becomes very easy. But the point you made about festivals, I find it astonishing that Wireless, for example, will have some of these artists, and I look at the, you know, not that I've ever gone to Wireless. That's not true, I have gone back in 2007, before, like, you know, you saw black artists really on there. But now you've got drill artists, and I'm like, what, he only came out last month. And
the gentrification.
I can't quite work out how this has happened.
Do you know how I explain it? It's like when you go to a really expensive gourmet burger place, right? And you know, as soon as you see those lights, you know stuff's about to get expensive. And you make your order, and then they bring the burger out with the basket fries, and the burger's served on slate. And you didn't ask, why is my burger on slate? You haven't asked, is there lead in that slate? You've just picked up your burger and eaten it, right? But it's still a burger. So what they've done is been able to package that genre, the corporates, to sell back, because it's an industry that was dying. Now, you know, in the corporate world, you've got a thing called CSR, corporate social responsibility, and people often talk about fair trade and talk about, you know, ethical purchasing and, you know, farmer to table, right, and all that kind of stuff, right? There's no CSR in music. These corporate companies who are pushing that violence, where's your, you know, corporate social responsibility is not you going and painting a youth club. It's about what are you promoting, what are you making money off? And if it's off the death of young people, that's not corporate social responsibility. So they're so far removed from the reality of what's happening on the streets, because now they have to get a piece of that industry who, those artists will tell you themselves, and it's interesting we're having a wider conversation about the murder media. Those artists who started out, you know, on the grind early, kept it, you know, 100, then moved across to pop music, right, who they openly say themselves, now have gone back to the origin. There's been 3 waves. On this wave, the corporates have stepped in. And now they can put fire under it, right? Which means that it becomes, we hear me talking about the forest fire. The forest fire now, what you're seeing, because when I go, I know, some of these small towns where we're working, the young people are dressing exactly the same as in my city, your city. The music's the same, the language is the same. One of the pluses of that is people are more open to diversity.
Yes, yes.
Diversity. But a majority of people who buy into it, they have the switch off. They have the counter narrative.
But here's the problem though. I think you're right. Because a man in Devon can now listen to One Extra in the same way a man in central London in the state, in East London, you can do it. Right, you do have diversity, but diversity does not equal inclusion.
No, because there's a difference between you pull back your curtains and you see cows, and you pull back your curtains and you see man trapping and gangs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the counter narrative is what helps. If you're going back to a nice leafy community, if you're going back to double income families, if you're going back to a school that's achieving, that when you land at that school says to you, round here we get 10 A's. It's different to the school where you go, just get 5 A to C's.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a fair point. But do you think there needs to be, so you talk about corporate responsibility and we can look at different firms and different organisations. Does there need to be corporate responsibility for the radio selectors and the DJs? Because ultimately, and also not just there, but I don't know what it was like when you got signed, whether they assigned you an A&R or somebody to help you.
And the chaperone.
Yeah, chaperone and mentor you and, you know, make sure you don't go X, Y, and Z. When I see certain artists still getting caught up in certain situations which result in jail terms and all this, I have to ask the question, where's the role models, where's the mentors around them? I don't see it as much. But what I do see is older people who are DJs, gatekeepers, who you could argue keep exploiting.
Yeah. You're talking about Westwood, right?
Well, you know, I was trying to be a little bit polite, we can talk about him and drop it on
there's 3 simple things for me. If you're a 61-year-old male, private school educated, your dad was a bishop, right? You have no right to be bringing inner city young people into your studio to reinforce that level of violence. Where's the pro-social modelling, right? You know, and it's well documented, the history of people like that who were early adopters around hip-hop, American hip-hop, and some of the founding kind of thought leaders around British hip-hop. But we're talking about 2019 now, right? And as part of our culture of people of colour and being African-centred on top of that, is that you mentioned about the rites of passage, but as elders, you have to bring young people through. It's part of our culture, right? None of us are angels, none of us are perfect, we learn. But when I'm seeing that from elders, right, I don't recognise that as a man of colour.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because it hurts me to see as an elder, as a father in the community, not just my own children, father of the community, doing things and seeing young people being used like that in a way I would never do.
But there's a thing called child violence exploitation, right? And sociologically, we have to start asking these questions about, you know, no one's saying that it's not their art form, your art form. No one's, you know, we don't critique the art in that sense. What we're saying, people like myself are saying is, kids are getting lowered into the ground. They're not even seeing their 18th birthday, right? And they're not coming back. They're not coming back. So back to what I said originally about raising the consciousness. Raising the consciousness means we want these young men, primarily, and girls, and these other communities, we want them to see adulthood. And anyone stopping them from seeing adulthood needs to be checked, right? Needs to be checked. Because I would rather see, well, okay, you bring them into the studio, but how about getting them a job in marketing, getting them an internship, right? Yeah, teach them how to be an engineer. The engineer always lasts longer than the person on the mic.
100%.
Right? Now, back to violence exploitation. And if it's not for me to convince people, it's to say, well, let's look at the fruits, right? A tree is known by its fruits. So if young people are on those platforms and they're dying, they're being murdered, who's paying for their funerals? You know, people like, you know, who bringing them in. And people say, oh, but Ray, it's giving the youth them a platform. Okay, it's giving the youth them a platform. But giving them a real platform is giving them sustainability.
Yes.
That's the platform I want to see, sustainability, because, as I said, the false economy, you get caught up in views. Views don't always equal dough, right? It gives you exposure. And I think for me, more and more, I'm passionate about that same thing. How do you build peace? You know, and the fortunate thing in my role of being able to work in schools, in prisons, work with families, work with people who are, you know, who are former bangers. And my message has always been the same. How do we measure distance travelled? How do we get you from here to here? Because if I haven't got you from here to here, then I have to look at myself as a practitioner. There's got to be a time when you say to me, Ray, I don't need you again, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah? And that's all, we all have a role to play, whether you're the DJ, whether you're the teacher, whether you're the pastor, the imam, we all have a role to play.
Well, it's interesting you said that. I mean, what I wanted to just quickly touch on, because as always, we're going to need a part 2. This time we'll come to Birmingham and do it in your neck of the woods. But one of the things I've done in PowerTalk season 1 was that I interviewed pastors of different denominations to give just a perspective of what the church is doing and what the church isn't doing and what we can improve on. And I know that you work with a variety of faith groups. Just give us a bit of a perspective. I mean, as a pastor, I know a lot about what's going on in the church community. Yeah. How does, you know, the Muslim community, the Hindu, Sikh, even Jewish community, how are they responding to this issue? Is there stuff we can learn from, in your experience? Yeah.
Well, I think we have to go back and remind people that the youth work was founded in the faith community in this country. You know, people might not recognise it, but, you know, the Cobs and the Scouts and the Boys Brigades and all these, and William Bowden, you know. Generically, across all faiths, I don't believe they're doing enough. If you just look at the social capital, if you look at the spaces that faith groups own, right? If you look at the income generated through tithes, through zakat, through sadaqah, if you look at the knowledge equity in the congregations, right? And I say this to people, and some people don't like it, but it is what it is. Some things you can't pray your way out of. It warrants action. Even scripture tells you that, whatever faith you follow, right? It warrants action. And if the only time faith groups are turning up is to bury the dead, then I don't understand what scripture that is. So, and as we look across, you know, as you said, I mentioned, you know, visited many a faith group and done work with them around different things. And someone said, oh, have you seen the chandelier? We flew that in from so-and-so, you know, it's 40 bags. But have you got a part-time youth worker here? I'm not interested in your carpet. I'm not interested in the carpet. If you're in a hotspot area and guns bossing and you don't have a youth worker, you don't have a youth space, and we're going beyond pool and table tennis. And here's another thing as well. Let's put an additional thing on top of that. There's a difference between youth work and working with young people. If you're working with your congregation's children, that's working with young people. But if you go over to the road to them man there who are shutting and say, look, once a week we cook a food over here, you know, just come and plug in. Not put down that food, bro, you're going to hell. This space is available for you. Yeah. Even if you just want to talk.
But you're talking a lot about relationship, which is massively important. You're talking about resources. What a lot of faith groups will say to me is that when we got the heart, but we haven't got the knowledge and we're not knowing how to be equipped. So then you sometimes say, all right, cool, well, guess what Power to Fight particularly can do, and other organisations, we can equip and train you. But even within that, and there's hundreds of faith groups we have trained, there's still a resistance. Because what I find with faith groups in particular, the idea of collaboration and partnership, and also acknowledging we haven't got the answers, we haven't got all the answers, I think is scary for some faith groups, because they're like, well, hold on, what, you're asking me to get knowledge from outside of scripture? even though from a Christian perspective, there's this thing called common grace where we believe everybody has got something to bring to the table. But what I find is that so many faith groups are resistant because it's like nervous. And it's a shame because if I was like that, we would not have met. If I was like that, the partnership approach which Power to Fight brings to the table would not be working.
We just lost 3 teenagers in 10 days. The murder scenes of 2.4 miles between them. Right, 3 in 10 days. Right? And there was a big conversation around the role of faith groups. And what it shows me is people don't, this isn't complex. The starting point is to be present. That's it. You've got it. Are you present? You don't have to be a systemic gangs therapist and have all the understanding about trauma and all the understanding around, you know, the neuroscience of violence and criminology and murder media and academia. Just be present, because the human-to-human connection is what will always be enough. Working in London for many years, I always say this to you. I used to talk to people on the tube. Because in my culture, from a Birmingham perspective, I can't be nose to nose with someone for 40 minutes and I don't say, how you doing, mate? Where you off to today? And then I'm like, no, you can't speak to people on the tube. Culture.
Yeah.
And once we start removing the human to human, just be present. Be present. That's it. And as faith communities, are we present?
Do you know what? That's a fair point. We're coming to the time when we need to.
Yeah.
But I always say this, you know, if there's anything that, you know, you want to leave a nugget of wisdom, the whole thing's been like riveting. And I've known you for long enough to know that anything you touch, when you touch Mike, it's serious stuff. Anything you want to just finish on, anything where you feel like, you know what, I just want to touch on this quickly or just...
Yeah, I think we're in an interesting time, because as I said, our relationship is 10 years old. And some of the things you heard us and myself and some of our team saying back then have come to fruition. And just like a lot of the music's being gentrified, so is this sector. And people talk about a public health response to violence, but there's 2 words missing: a community-centred public health response to violence. Right? With this agenda, you cannot parachute in, right? Throw a few plasters on things and bail. Because you've got to, I really believe you've got to have some equity in the community that you're serving. Not that you're the same ethnicity, not that you're the same equity. If you want to change these communities, you have to have, and this comes out of working nationally, you have to bring communities on the journey with you. Public health, the concept of a public health response has almost been hijacked. We're back to the burger on the slate. Now it's been packaged. But how can you work in some of these communities? If I took you to the local dumpling shop, you're going to start shaking. How are you going to work with communities? The communities themselves don't know who you are or your organisation or what you stand for or what your ethos is. You can look amazing in the bid. You can look amazing online, but when it comes to in the trenches, and not every community, not every organisation is a trench-based organisation, but we're talking about building backup communities, communities that have been hurt, are full of trauma, communities that have been let down, communities that have got geniuses in them, but they don't realise it. Some of them, communities that now are you know, so embedded around violence. So I would say is, unless your work is not community-centred, that doesn't mean it's in a community centre, let me be clear, community-centred. If you don't have buy-in from those communities, it's not going to work.
And that comes back down to relationship, isn't it? And
visibility, relationship, and you know, if we can't hear or see you after 5 o'clock, then we're back to the American word, the projects. And these communities aren't projects. And one other final thing. I think one of the biggest problems is we're adults advocating for a youth problem. And we have to start now, I believe, bringing through these young leaders. So you take the example of the marching against climate change. You've got 10,000 young people marching against climate change because they're saying, hold on a minute, is this what's going to happen in 15 years' time? And people would argue, the cynics will say, yeah, but it's adults pushing them. I don't find a problem with adults steering them. Pushing them is different, steering them. What would happen if every other week we had 10,000 young people marching against knife crime?
Yeah.
And I'm not advocating them bunking off school, but what I'm saying is young people standing up and saying, well, this is enough. You'd start to see the change.
I think it's a fascinating point. I mean, when I was watching that Extinction Rebellion, I said to some of my white middle class friends, boy, when you really want to get in the mix, you really do. You know, you galvanise and mobilise and you get professional. I can't remember how long it was, maybe it was 2 weeks they were shutting down London. By that time they raised £180,000 just from donations coming in. And it got me thinking exactly on those lines. What would that look like if we could somehow mobilise young people to be in the mix in the same way? And I think that is a longer conversation, but I think you're onto something.
Yeah, because you've got to move away from projects to movements.
Oh, 100.
This is what it's about. These projects, right, are kind of like drops in the ocean. But movements, when you build peace, when you build resilience, when you build a culture of, you know what, this is our future now, right? Ultimately, it means that me and you are no longer relevant.
Yeah,
right?
oh, yeah.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
That's the handover. That's the pro-social modelling. That's the elders being told, we don't need you any longer. Thank you, we've got it from here, to coin a Triquest phrase. And that's what we need to see more of. Movement building, right? And if we, this last 18 months, where you've seen what's happening, where kind of non-traditional communities now, their young people are falling victim to violence, right? Young people from leafy suburbs, grammar schools, inner, you know, they're all our children,
yes,
right? And I'm not just kind of saying to philosophize it. They're all our children. We, you know, and the beautiful thing when I walk into some of these towns who are up north, and I step in, I know they've never seen someone as big and hairy as me. But you know when a kid contacts you or a family contacts you through email and they find you, they find you and say, you know what, there's something that you said to me that I'm going to take forward in my life, Ray. Be present.
Ray, as a practitioner, but more as a friend, it's always just a privilege just to hear you speak. You bring so much knowledge. And also a lightness, even though we deal with a very dark situation, you bring a light to it. Keep going. You are part of Power to Fight. Bro.
Thank you, King, man.
Respect, man.
Yeah, man, you've done already.
So, yeah, nice one.